In the shadows of ancient stone corridors where secrets have been buried for centuries, a single photograph would bring down the most powerful monarchy in Europe. Lady Victoria Ashworth never imagined that her morning walk through the royal gardens would lead her to witness something that would make her question everything she believed about honor, loyalty, and the crown she had sworn to serve. What she saw that misty Tuesday morning would either save the kingdom or destroy it forever. Some secrets are worth killing for, and in the halls of Ravencrest Palace, trust is the most dangerous luxury of all. Lady Victoria Ashworth pressed her face against the cold library window, watching the morning mist roll across the sprawling gardens of Ravencrest Palace. At 28, she had served as the royal family's chief archivist for 3 years, a position that granted her access to corridors and chambers most palace staff never saw. Her fingers traced the condensation on the glass as she observed the groundskeepers preparing for another day of maintaining the pristine grounds that surrounded the ancient stronghold of the Montclair dynasty. The Montclairs had ruled the fictional kingdom of Aldoria for over 4 centuries, and Victoria had dedicated her life to preserving their legacy. Every morning, she arrived at the palace library before dawn, surrounded by leather-bound volumes, ancient manuscripts, and countless artifacts that told the story of a royal lineage that had weathered wars, scandals, and political upheavals. Yet nothing in those historical records had prepared her for what she was about to discover. King Edmund Montclair, the 62-year-old monarch, was beloved by his people. His wife, Queen Isabella, had brought grace and charity work to the forefront of the royal image. Their son, Crown Prince Alexander, was preparing for his eventual ascension to the throne, while their daughter, Princess Sophia, had become a champion for environmental causes. To the outside world, the Montclairs represented everything noble about modern monarchy. Victoria turned away from the window and walked toward the restricted section of the library, where she had been tasked with cataloging a recently discovered collection of documents from the palace's East Wing renovation. The workers had found a hidden compartment behind what appeared to be a decorative panel, revealing boxes of papers, photographs, and small artifacts that had been concealed for decades. As she carefully opened the first mahogany box, the scent of aged paper and lavender sachets filled her nostrils. Inside, she found correspondence dating back to the 1980s, written in the elegant handwriting she recognized as belonging to the late Queen Mother, Edmund's predecessor who had passed away 15 years ago. Most of the letters appeared to be routine correspondence with various charitable organizations and foreign dignitaries. However, as Victoria delved deeper into the collection, she noticed something peculiar. Several letters contained references to something called Project Sanctuary and mentioned meetings with individuals whose names she didn't recognize from any official palace records. The correspondence spoke of securing the future and protecting what belongs to the crown, but the context remained frustratingly vague. In a third box, Victoria discovered a series of black and white photographs that made her breath catch in her throat. The images showed various members of the royal family from decades past, but they weren't the formal portraits or candid family shots she expected. Instead, these photographs captured clandestine meetings in what appeared to be underground chambers she had never seen before, despite her extensive knowledge of the palace layout. One photograph in particular drew her attention. It showed a much younger King Edmund, perhaps in his 30s, standing beside several men in expensive suits. They were gathered around an ornate table covered with what appeared to be ancient artifacts, jeweled objects, and stacks of documents. The setting looked like some sort of secret vault with stone walls and elaborate security measures visible in the background. Victoria's hands trembled as she examined the photograph more closely. On the table, she could make out several items that looked remarkably similar to pieces from the royal collection currently displayed in the palace's public galleries. However, according to the official records she maintained, those particular artifacts had been lost during a supposed burglary in the 1970s, an incident that had been thoroughly investigated but never solved. The implications of what she was seeing began to dawn on her. If these artifacts weren't actually stolen, but had been secretly moved and hidden, it would suggest that the royal family had deliberately deceived the public and possibly committed insurance fraud on a massive scale. The lost treasures were worth millions of pounds and had been mourned as irreplaceable pieces of Valdoria's cultural heritage. As Victoria continued examining the photographs, she noticed that several showed the same underground chamber from different angles. The room was clearly designed for storage and secrecy, with multiple safes, climate control systems, and what appeared to be sophisticated security equipment that looked far more advanced than anything the palace had in the 1980s. This wasn't a temporary hiding place. It was a permanent, professionally designed vault. Her discovery was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the library. Victoria quickly gathered the photographs and documents, her heart racing as she tried to appear casually engaged in her normal cataloging work. The footsteps passed by without stopping, but the incident reminded her of how exposed she was in this situation. That evening, Victoria returned to her modest apartment in the palace staff quarters with her mind reeling from the day's discoveries. She had photographed several of the most incriminating documents and images with her personal camera, though she knew that removing any materials from the library without permission was grounds for immediate dismissal and possible criminal charges. As she reviewed the copied photographs on her laptop, Victoria began to piece together a disturbing timeline. The secret vault appeared to have been constructed sometime in the late 1970s, around the same time as the supposed burglary that had claimed so many royal treasures. The correspondence suggested that this project had been orchestrated by the late Queen Mother with the knowledge and participation of the current King Edmund. But what troubled Victoria most was a series of financial documents she had found mixed in with the photographs. These papers indicated large, regular payments being made to various offshore accounts, with cryptic references to security maintenance and preservation costs. The amounts were staggering, suggesting that millions of pounds had been secretly moved out of official royal accounts over the course of several decades. Victoria realized she was holding evidence of what appeared to be one of the largest financial scandals in modern royal history. The Montclair family, who preached duty and service to their subjects, had apparently been systematically looting their own heritage and hiding the proceeds in secret accounts. The beloved royal family that Valdoria's citizens trusted and supported with their taxes had been living a lie for over 40 years. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on Victoria as she sat in her small apartment, surrounded by evidence that could destroy not just the royal family, but potentially the entire monarchical system of Valdoria. She thought about the thousands of palace employees whose livelihoods depended on the institution, the tourism industry built around the royal brand, and the national identity that was so deeply tied to the Montclair legacy. As midnight approached, Victoria made a decision that would change her life forever. She carefully organized copies of the most damaging evidence into a secure folder on her laptop and began composing a detailed report outlining everything she had discovered. She wasn't sure what she would do with this information, but she knew that pretending she had never seen it wasn't an option. Outside her window, Ravencrest Palace stood majestically against the starlit sky, its ancient towers and walls holding secrets that Victoria was only beginning to uncover. She had always believed that truth and transparency were fundamental values, even in service to the crown. Now she would have to decide whether those values were worth risking everything she had worked for. The next morning would bring new discoveries that would make her current dilemma seem simple by comparison. As Victoria finally fell asleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that somehow her late-night research had not gone unnoticed by forces within the palace who had spent decades keeping these secrets buried. Victoria woke before her alarm, her dreams haunted by images of secret vaults and clandestine meetings. As she prepared for another day at the palace library, she noticed a small envelope that had been slipped under her door sometime during the night. Her name was written on it in elegant script, but there was no indication of who had delivered it. Inside the envelope, she found a single photograph and a brief typed note. The photograph showed her sitting at her laptop the previous evening, clearly taken from outside her apartment window. The note contained just 4 words: "Some secrets stay buried." Victoria's hands shook as she realized the implications. Someone knew about her discovery and was watching her. The photograph proved that her apartment was under surveillance, and the message was an unmistakable threat. She quickly gathered the evidence she had copied and hid it in a sealed plastic bag inside her bathroom ventilation system, the only place in her small apartment that seemed secure from prying eyes. At the library that morning, Victoria tried to maintain her normal routine while keeping careful watch for any signs of surveillance. She noticed that Harold Pemberton, the elderly palace security chief, seemed to be making more frequent rounds past the library than usual. His weathered face remained impassive, but Victoria caught him glancing in her direction several times with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. As she continued cataloging the discovered documents, Victoria made another disturbing find. Hidden beneath a false bottom in one of the wooden boxes, she discovered a detailed floor plan of the palace that showed passages and rooms she had never seen before. The blueprint revealed an entire underground level beneath the East Wing, accessible through hidden entrances that had been cleverly concealed within the palace's original architecture. The underground level included not just the vault she had seen in the photographs, but also living quarters, meeting rooms, and what appeared to be a sophisticated communication center. Notes scrawled in the margins indicated that this hidden complex had been constructed during the major renovation of the palace in the 1970s, disguised as routine structural improvements. Victoria realized that while she had been living and working in Ravencrest Palace for 3 years, she had only seen a fraction of its true layout. The royal family had been operating a secret facility directly beneath their feet, completely invisible to staff, visitors, and even most government officials who regularly conducted business at the palace. During her lunch break, Victoria decided to test her new knowledge by exploring some of the areas indicated on the blueprint. She made her way to the East Wing, ostensibly to conduct research in the historical record storage room, but actually to look for the concealed entrance marked on the plans. According to the blueprint, one of the hidden passages was accessible through what appeared to be a decorative bookshelf in a rarely used sitting room. Victoria waited until the corridor was empty, then slipped into the room and began examining the ornate wooden shelving. After several minutes of careful searching, she found a small, almost invisible lever disguised as a decorative carving. When she pulled the lever, a section of the bookshelf swung inward with surprising smoothness, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air that flowed up from below carried a faint scent of electronics and air conditioning, confirming that the underground facility was still active and maintained. Victoria hesitated at the threshold, knowing that stepping through this doorway would cross a line from which there might be no return. If she was caught exploring unauthorized areas of the palace, her position would be terminated immediately, and she could face criminal charges for trespassing in secure royal facilities. But the need to understand the full scope of what she had discovered outweighed her fear. Victoria activated the flashlight app on her phone and carefully descended the stone steps, her footsteps echoing softly in the narrow passage. The staircase curved downward for what felt like several stories before opening into a well-lit corridor lined with modern security equipment. The underground complex was far more sophisticated than the old photographs had suggested. Motion sensors tracked her movement, and she could see camera lenses following her progress down the hallway. The walls were lined with climate-controlled storage units, each secured with electronic locks that required both key cards and biometric scanning to access. As Victoria explored deeper into the facility, she began to understand the true magnitude of what the royal family had created. This wasn't just a hiding place for stolen artifacts. It was a comprehensive operations center designed for activities that needed to remain completely separate from the official functions of the monarchy. In one room, she found banks of computer servers and communication equipment that looked capable of monitoring phone calls, internet traffic, and possibly even satellite communications. Another room contained what appeared to be a professional document forgery operation, complete with antique paper, historical inks, and equipment for aging artificial documents to make them appear centuries old. But it was the main vault that truly took Victoria's breath away. The chamber was enormous, with walls lined from floor to ceiling with artifacts, artworks, and treasures that represented centuries of Valdorian cultural heritage. Many of the items she recognized from historical records as pieces that had supposedly been lost, stolen, or destroyed over the decades. Ancient crowns, ceremonial weapons, priceless paintings, and religious artifacts filled custom-designed display cases. The collection was worth hundreds of millions of pounds, far exceeding the value of the official royal treasury that was displayed to the public. Victoria realized she was looking at the true crown jewels of Valdoria, hidden away, while inferior copies or less valuable pieces were shown to citizens who believed they were viewing their genuine national treasures. As she walked through the vault, Victoria began photographing everything she could, though she was careful to disable her phone's flash to avoid triggering any additional security systems. The scope of the deception was overwhelming. Not only had the royal family stolen from their own heritage, but they had been systematically replacing authentic artifacts with forgeries, essentially selling off Valdoria's history, while maintaining the illusion that nothing was missing. Her exploration was suddenly interrupted by the sound of voices echoing from the corridor she had entered through. Victoria quickly switched off her phone's light and pressed herself against one of the display cases, her heart pounding as she realized that someone else was entering the underground complex. The voices grew closer, and Victoria could make out at least two different speakers engaged in what sounded like a heated discussion. She recognized one voice as belonging to Prince Alexander, the crown prince whose public image was that of a responsible future monarch dedicated to modernizing the royal family's approach to public service. "The archivist is becoming a problem," Alexander was saying. "Harold's people confirmed that she's been accessing materials she shouldn't have seen. We need to decide how to handle this before it escalates." The second voice was older, more gravelly, and Victoria thought it might belong to Lord Chancellor Hampton, the king's chief advisor who had served the royal family for over 30 years. "We've maintained operational security for 4 decades, Hampton replied. "One curious librarian isn't going to bring down everything we've built, but we need to be strategic about our response." Victoria realized with growing horror that they were discussing her. The royal family knew about her discoveries and was actively planning some sort of response to neutralize the threat she represented. The casual tone of their conversation suggested that this wasn't the first time they had dealt with someone who had stumbled upon their secrets. As the voices drew closer to the vault, Victoria frantically looked for another exit. According to the blueprint she had studied, there should be multiple passages connecting different parts of the underground complex. She spotted what appeared to be another doorway, partially hidden behind one of the larger display cases, and quickly made her way toward it. The door opened into a narrow service tunnel that seemed to run parallel to the main corridor. Victoria could still hear the conversation between Alexander and Hampton, but their voices were now muffled by the walls. She followed the tunnel, hoping it would lead to another exit that would allow her to return to the upper levels without being detected. As she navigated the dark passage, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message that made her blood run cold. The message was from an unknown number and contained just 2 words, "Stop looking." Someone was monitoring her location in real time, even in the underground complex that should have been shielded from most electronic surveillance. The level of technological sophistication involved suggested that the royal family had resources and capabilities that went far beyond what she had imagined possible. Victoria quickened her pace through the tunnel, desperate to reach safety before whoever was tracking her decided to take more direct action. The tunnel eventually led to another concealed entrance, this one opening into the palace's wine cellar, an area she was familiar with from her regular duties. As she emerged into the familiar surroundings of the upper palace, Victoria realized that her life had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a palace employee who had stumbled upon some interesting historical documents. She was now a threat to a conspiracy that involved the highest levels of the royal family and had been operating successfully for decades. The evidence she had gathered was explosive, but she was beginning to understand that simply possessing this information put her in mortal danger. The casual way Prince Alexander and Lord Chancellor Hampton had discussed handling her suggested that the royal family was prepared to use extreme measures to protect their secrets. As Victoria returned to her apartment that evening, she noticed several subtle changes that indicated someone had been inside during her absence. Books were slightly out of place, drawers were not quite closed in the same positions, and her laptop had been moved by mere inches. The intrusion had been professional and nearly undetectable, but Victoria's growing paranoia made her sensitive to even minor disturbances. She quickly checked her hiding place in the ventilation system and was relieved to find that her copied evidence appeared to be undisturbed. However, she realized that it was only a matter of time before her pursuers discovered her backup materials, and she needed to find a way to get the information to safety before that happened. Victoria spent a sleepless night planning her next move. The text message warning and the search of her apartment had made it clear that staying within the palace walls was no longer safe. She needed to find a way to get her evidence to someone who could act on it, but she also knew that most of Valdoria's media outlets and government officials had close relationships with the royal family that made them unlikely allies. The following morning, Victoria called in sick to work, claiming a sudden illness that would keep her away from the library for several days. This would buy her time to act, while hopefully preventing immediate suspicion about her absence. She spent the morning researching investigative journalists and international media contact who might be interested in a story of this magnitude. Through her research, she identified Marcus Webb, a British investigative reporter who had previously exposed corruption scandals involving several European royal families. Webb worked for an independent news organization that specialized in high-stakes investigative journalism and had a reputation for protecting sources even under extreme pressure. Victoria crafted a carefully worded email to Webb, providing just enough detail to capture his interest without revealing the full scope of her evidence. She explained that she had discovered documentation of financial irregularities and possible art forgeries involving a European royal family, and that she had evidence that could substantiate claims of systematic fraud spanning multiple decades. To her surprise, Webb responded within hours, expressing serious interest in her claims and suggesting a secure meeting to review her materials. However, he also warned her that investigating royal families was extremely dangerous and that she should take immediate precautions to protect both herself and her evidence. Webb's response included detailed instructions for secure communications and suggested that Victoria should create multiple copies of her evidence, storing them in different locations to prevent their destruction if her activities were discovered. He also recommended that she should prepare to leave Valdoria quickly if the situation became too dangerous. Following Webb's advice, Victoria spent the afternoon creating encrypted digital copies of her evidence and uploading them to secure cloud storage accounts. She also prepared a detailed written statement explaining everything she had discovered, including the layout of the underground complex and the specific artifacts she had observed in the secret vault. That evening, Victoria met Webb at a small cafe in the capital city, several miles from Ravencrest Palace. The journalist was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with sharp intelligence in his eyes and a demeanor that suggested he was accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations. Webb reviewed the materials Victoria had brought, his expression growing more serious as he examined each photograph and document. When she showed him the blueprint of the underground complex, he whistled softly and shook his head in amazement. "This is bigger than anything I've ever investigated," Webb said quietly. "If even half of what you're showing me is accurate, this would be the scandal of the century. But you realize that pursuing this story could get both of us killed." Victoria nodded, having already considered that possibility. "I've worked for the royal family for 3 years," she replied. I believed in what they represented, and I dedicated my life to preserving their legacy, discovering that it's all been built on lies and theft. I can't pretend I never saw this. Webb spent another hour reviewing the evidence and asking detailed questions about Victoria's discoveries. He was particularly interested in the financial documents that suggested ongoing payments to offshore accounts, as these could potentially be traced to identify the current scope of the royal family's hidden operations. "We need more than what you've gathered so far," Webb explained. "These documents and photographs are compelling, but we need evidence that shows the current extent of their activities. If this is just historical wrongdoing from decades ago, it's still a huge story, but if they're actively continuing these operations, it becomes something much bigger." Victoria understood what Webb was suggesting. To build a truly compelling case, she would need to gather fresh evidence of ongoing criminal activity, which would require her to return to the underground complex and potentially intercept current communications or financial transactions. The prospect of going back into that hidden facility terrified her, especially knowing that the royal family was already aware of her suspicious activities. But Victoria also realized that without additional evidence, her current materials might not be enough to ensure that the story would be believed or that appropriate action would be taken. Webb provided Victoria with sophisticated surveillance equipment, including miniature cameras, audio recording devices, and secure communication tools that would allow her to document whatever she found during future explorations. He also gave her contact information for safe houses and extraction routes that could be used if she needed to flee Valdoria quickly. Over the following week, Victoria carefully planned her return to the underground complex. She studied the blueprint extensively, identifying multiple routes and exit strategies that would minimize her chances of being trapped if she encountered security personnel or members of the royal family. Her opportunity came during the annual state opening ceremony, when most of the royal family and senior staff would be occupied with official duties for several hours. Victoria used her knowledge of the palace's security rotations to identify a window of time when the East Wing would have minimal surveillance. This time, her exploration of the underground complex was much more systematic. Victoria methodically photographed everything in the main vault, documenting serial numbers and authentication marks that would allow experts to verify that these were indeed the genuine artifacts that had supposedly been lost or stolen over the decades. In the communications center, she discovered active monitoring equipment that was currently intercepting phone calls and internet communications from various government offices and media organizations throughout Valdoria. The royal family was essentially running a domestic spying operation that allowed them to monitor any potential threats to their secret activities. Most disturbing of all, Victoria found evidence that the underground complex was still being actively expanded. Construction materials and architectural plans showed that additional vault space and surveillance capabilities were being added, suggesting that the royal family's criminal activities were not historical relics, but ongoing operations that were growing in scope and sophistication. Victoria's documentation of the active surveillance equipment provided the current evidence that Webb had said was necessary to build a compelling case. The royal family wasn't just guilty of historical crimes. They were actively engaged in illegal spying operations that threatened the basic privacy and democratic rights of Valdorian citizens. As she prepared to leave the underground complex, Victoria encountered something that changed everything. In what appeared to be a private office area, she found correspondence and meeting notes that revealed the existence of similar operations in other European monarchies. The Valdorian royal family wasn't acting alone. They were part of an international network of royal houses that were coordinating their illegal activities and sharing resources. The documents suggested that several major European royal families had been collaborating for decades to hide assets, manipulate media coverage, and eliminate threats to their secret operations. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than Victoria had imagined, involving billions of dollars and potentially affecting the political stability of multiple nations. Among the correspondence, Victoria found references to something called Operation Crown Shield, which appeared to be a coordinated plan to discredit or eliminate journalists, investigators, and government officials who had gotten too close to uncovering the truth about royal family criminal activities. Most chilling of all, she found a list of names labeled neutralized threats that included several journalists and investigators who had died in supposedly accidental circumstances over the past decade. Marcus Webb's name was not on the list, but Victoria realized that their investigation was putting both of them in the crosshairs of an organization that had apparently been willing to commit murder to protect its secrets. As Victoria finally made her way back to the surface, she carried with her evidence of crimes that went far beyond simple theft and fraud. She had uncovered proof of an international conspiracy involving multiple royal families, systematic violation of citizens' privacy rights, and what appeared to be a pattern of assassinations designed to silence those who threatened to expose the truth. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable. Victoria realized that she had stumbled into something so large and dangerous that even getting the story published might not be enough to ensure her safety. The forces she was up against had resources, connections, and a demonstrated willingness to kill that made her feel like a small fish swimming in an ocean full of sharks. But she also knew that walking away was no longer an option. Too many people had already died to protect these secrets, and too many citizens have been betrayed by the very institutions they trusted to serve their interests. Whatever the personal cost, Victoria was determined to ensure that the truth finally came to light. Victoria met with Marcus Webb the following day at a different location, a small bookstore in the old quarter of the capital city where they could speak privately among the stacks of ancient volumes. When she shared her latest discoveries, including evidence of the international conspiracy and the list of neutralized threats, Webb's expression became grave. "This changes everything," he said, studying the photographs of documents that detailed Operation Crown Shield. "We're not just dealing with one corrupt royal family anymore. This is an international criminal organization that happens to be made up of hereditary monarchs. The resources and connections they have access to make them incredibly dangerous." Webb explained that several of the journalists whose names appeared on the neutralized list had been colleagues of his. Their deaths had been attributed to car accidents, sudden illnesses, and other seemingly natural causes, but the timing had always seemed suspicious to those who knew what stories they had been investigating. "We need to move quickly," Webb continued. "If they're monitoring communications as extensively as your evidence suggests, they probably already know that we've been in contact. We need to get this story published before they can stop us." However, publishing the story presented its own challenges. The evidence was so explosive that most traditional media outlets would be reluctant to run it without extensive legal review, which could take weeks or months. During that time, Victoria and Webb would be vulnerable to retaliation from the royal conspiracy. Webb suggested that they should prepare the story for simultaneous publication by multiple independent media organizations across different countries. This strategy would make it much harder for the royal families to suppress the information through legal threats or other pressure tactics. Over the next several days, Webb worked with trusted contacts at newspapers and online publications in Britain, Germany, France, and the United States to prepare a coordinated release of the story. Victoria provided additional documentation and answered detailed questions about her discoveries, helping to build a comprehensive narrative that would be difficult for the royal families to discredit. Meanwhile, Victoria continued her normal duties at the palace library, though she was constantly aware that her every move was likely being monitored. She noticed that several new security personnel had been assigned to the palace, and Harold Pemberton seemed to be watching her with increasing intensity. On Thursday evening, Victoria received a phone call that made her blood run cold. The caller's voice was electronically distorted, but the message was clear. "You have 48 hours to destroy all materials related to your recent research and resign your position at the palace. Failure to comply will result in permanent consequences." The threat confirmed that the royal family knew exactly what Victoria had discovered and was prepared to take extreme measures to silence her. She immediately contacted Webb, who activated the emergency protocols they had established for this situation. Webb arranged for Victoria to be moved to a safe house operated by an organization that specialized in protecting journalists and sources who were facing threats from powerful interests. The location was a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood of the capital, chosen specifically because it would not attract the attention of anyone looking for a fleeing palace employee. From a safe house, Victoria and Webb finalized preparations for publishing the story. They decided to release the initial article within 24 hours, before the deadline specified in the threat Victoria had received. This would hopefully prevent the royal family from taking action against her, while also ensuring that the evidence would become public even if something happened to either of them. The night before publication, Victoria couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of the safe house, looking out at the ordinary street where families were settling down for the evening, completely unaware that their entire understanding of their country's leadership was about to be shattered. She thought about the 3 years she had spent working at Ravencrest Palace, believing that she was serving something noble and historic. The discovery that it had all been built on lies and crime felt like a personal betrayal, but she also recognized that her fellow citizens deserved to know the truth about the people they supported with their taxes and loyalty. Early Friday morning, the story broke simultaneously across multiple news outlets. The Crown Conspiracy: Evidence Reveals International Royal Criminal Network was the headline that appeared on newspaper websites and social media feeds throughout Europe and beyond. The initial articles focused on the Valdorian royal family's secret vault, the forged artifacts in their public collection, and the financial fraud that had been perpetrated over multiple decades. However, Webb and his collaborating journalists had coordinated their coverage to gradually reveal the broader international conspiracy over the course of several days, building a narrative that would be difficult for readers to dismiss as fabrication. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours of publication, angry crowds began gathering outside Ravencrest Palace, demanding answers from King Edmund and his family. Social media erupted with discussions about the evidence, the implications for other royal families, and demands for immediate investigation by international law enforcement agencies. Government officials in Valdoria and other affected countries found themselves under intense pressure to respond to the allegations. Several members of parliament called for emergency sessions to discuss the evidence and consider appropriate action against the royal family. However, the royal family's response was swift and predictably aggressive. Within hours of the story's publication, teams of lawyers were filing lawsuits against the news outlets, claiming defamation and demanding immediate retractions. Palace spokespeople issued statements dismissing the allegations as malicious fabrications by disgruntled former employees and sensation-seeking journalists. More concerning for Victoria was the immediate escalation in threats against her personal safety. The safe house's security team reported multiple suspicious vehicles conducting surveillance of the building, and electronic monitoring indicated that various parties were actively trying to locate her through financial records, communication intercepts, and other tracking methods. Webb arranged for Victoria to be moved to a more secure location, a rural property operated by an international organization that specialized in protecting sources who had exposed major corruption. The new safe house was equipped with sophisticated security systems and was staffed by former intelligence operatives who understood the level of threat they were facing. From her new location, Victoria watched as the story continued to develop. Additional journalists in other countries began investigating their own royal families, using Victoria's evidence as a starting point for broader investigations. Within a week, similar allegations were being made against royal houses in 3 other European nations. The evidence Victoria had uncovered in the Valdorian Palace's underground complex proved to be just the tip of an iceberg. As more investigators joined the story, they began uncovering a network of criminal activity that stretched across multiple continents and involved not just theft and fraud, but also money laundering, tax evasion, and what appear to be systematic bribery of government officials. International law enforcement agencies, initially reluctant to investigate sitting royal families, found themselves under such intense public pressure that they had no choice but to open formal investigations. The evidence Webb and his colleagues had presented was too detailed and well-documented to be easily dismissed. However, Victoria also began to understand the true power of the forces she had challenged. The royal family's counterattack involved not just legal threats, but a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to discredit both the evidence and the people who had exposed it. False stories about Victoria's background began appearing in certain media outlets, suggesting that she had financial problems that might have motivated her to fabricate evidence against the royal family. Other articles questioned Webb's credibility and suggested that the entire investigation was part of a foreign plot to destabilize European monarchies. The disinformation campaign was so well-coordinated and professionally executed that Victoria realized the royal families had access to the same types of propaganda resources typically used by national intelligence agencies. The scope of their influence was far greater than she had imagined, extending deep into media organizations, government agencies, and law enforcement institutions. As Victoria watched the battle for public opinion unfold from her secure location, she began to understand that exposing the truth had been only the beginning. The royal conspiracy had spent decades building relationships and acquiring leverage that would make it extremely difficult to hold them accountable, even with overwhelming evidence of their crimes. The fight for justice was going to be much longer and more dangerous than Victoria had anticipated. But as she saw more journalists taking up the story and more citizens demanding answers from their leaders, she felt a growing sense of hope that the truth might ultimately prevail, even against opponents with seemingly unlimited resources and power. Part 5, 3 months after the story broke. Victoria watched from her secure location as the investigation into the royal conspiracy expanded far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. What had started with her discovery of hidden documents in a palace library had evolved into the largest international criminal investigation in modern history, involving law enforcement agencies from 12 countries and exposing a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government, business, and media. The evidence Victoria had initially uncovered proved to be authentic and devastating. Forensic experts confirmed that the artifacts in the Valdorian royal family's public collection were indeed forgeries, while the genuine pieces worth hundreds of millions of pounds remained hidden in the underground vault. Financial investigators traced the offshore accounts and discovered a complex web of transactions that had moved billions of dollars through shell companies and fake charitable organizations over the course of 4 decades. Most significantly, the international investigation revealed that the royal conspiracy had been operating with the knowledge and assistance of senior government officials in multiple countries. Prime ministers, cabinet members, and heads of intelligence agencies had been either bribed or blackmailed into providing protection for the royal family's criminal activities. King Edmund of Valdoria was the first monarch to face formal charges. A special prosecutor appointed by Parliament presented evidence of fraud, theft, money laundering, and conspiracy that was so comprehensive that even the king's most expensive lawyers advised him to consider a plea agreement. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 30 years in prison, a prospect that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Sophia were also indicted, though their lawyers argued that they had been unaware of the full extent of their family's criminal activities. However, Victoria's evidence from the underground complex included recordings of conversations that proved both siblings had been active participants in planning and executing various illegal operations. The international scope of the investigation created unprecedented diplomatic tensions. When similar evidence emerged linking royal families in Belgium, Sweden, and the Netherlands to the conspiracy, those governments found themselves facing constitutional crises that threatened the very existence of their monarchical systems. Public opinion across Europe had turned decisively against the implicated royal families. Massive demonstrations demanded the immediate abolition of monarchies in the affected countries, with protesters arguing that hereditary leadership had proven to be inherently corrupt and unaccountable to democratic oversight. Victoria had become an international symbol of courage and integrity, though the personal cost of her decision to speak out had been enormous. She remained under constant protection due to ongoing threats against her life, and she had been unable to return to normal life or maintain relationships with friends and family who might become targets of retaliation. The stress of living under protection while watching the investigation unfold had taken a significant toll on her mental and physical health. Victoria had lost 20 pounds and developed chronic insomnia as she struggled to cope with the magnitude of what she had set in motion. Therapists working with the protection team helped her understand that her feelings of guilt and overwhelm were normal responses to an extraordinary situation. Marcus Webb had won several international journalism awards for his coverage of the royal conspiracy, but he had also paid a personal price for his involvement. His investigation had made him a target not just of the royal families, but also of government officials and business interests who had been implicated in the expanding scandal. Like Victoria, he remained under protection and had been forced to live a highly restricted life. Despite the personal costs, both Victoria and Webb felt vindicated by the scope of what their investigation had revealed. The evidence had ultimately exposed not just individual crimes, but systematic corruption that had undermined democratic institutions and stolen resources that belonged to ordinary citizens who had trusted their leaders. The legal proceedings against the royal families became a media sensation that dominated news coverage for months. The trials featured testimony from dozens of witnesses, including former royal employees, government officials, and international business leaders who detailed the scope and methods of the conspiracy. King Edmund's trial was particularly dramatic, as prosecutors presented evidence that he had personally authorized illegal surveillance operations against journalists, judges, and political opponents who had threatened to expose his family's activities. The king, who had once been beloved by his subjects, was revealed to be a calculating criminal who had been willing to use murder and intimidation to protect his stolen wealth. The testimony of former royal employees was especially damaging, as it revealed that hundreds of people working at various palaces had been aware of suspicious activities, but had been threatened or bribed into silence. The culture of fear and secrecy that had protected the conspiracy for decades was systematically dismantled as witnesses came forward to tell their stories. International financial investigators discovered that the stolen artifacts and fraudulent schemes had generated over $3 billion in illegal proceeds that had been hidden in accounts around the world. The complexity of the money laundering operations suggested that the royal families had been working with professional criminal organizations and corrupt banking institutions to hide their activities. As the trials progressed, public support for maintaining monarchical systems in the affected countries continued to erode. Constitutional conventions were called in 3 nations to consider formally abolishing their royal families and transitioning to republican forms of government. The investigation also revealed disturbing connections between the royal conspiracy and various extremist political movements that had been funded with stolen money to create social instability that could be exploited for the royal family's benefit. This revelation further damaged public trust in traditional institutions and sparked broader discussions about corruption in democratic societies. For Victoria, watching the trials provided a sense of closure about her decision to expose the truth, but it also highlighted the enormous scope of damage that had been caused by decades of unchecked corruption. The stolen cultural artifacts represented not just financial losses, but the theft of entire nations' historical heritage that could never be fully recovered. As the first round of trials concluded, with King Edmund receiving a sentence of 25 years in prison, Victoria began considering what role she wanted to play in the continuing investigations. Prosecutors in several countries had asked her to serve as a consultant in their ongoing cases against other members of the royal conspiracy. The work would be dangerous and would require her to remain under protection for the foreseeable future. But Victoria had come to understand that her unique knowledge of the conspiracy's operations made her testimony crucial for ensuring that all of the criminals involved would be held accountable for their actions. Standing at the window of her latest safe house, Victoria looked out at a peaceful countryside that seemed disconnected from the international turmoil her discoveries had created. She thought about the thousands of ordinary citizens whose trust had been betrayed by the people they had been taught to respect and support. The royal conspiracy had stolen more than money and artifacts. It had stolen the faith that citizens had placed in their institutions and leaders. Rebuilding that trust would take generations. But Victoria believed that the painful process of exposing the truth was a necessary step toward creating more honest and accountable forms of government. The investigation had revealed that corruption could flourish even in seemingly stable democratic societies when powerful individuals believed themselves to be above the law. The royal families had used their traditional respect and ceremonial roles to hide criminal enterprises that had operated with impunity for decades. As Victoria prepared to testify in the next round of trials, she reflected on how her simple discovery in a palace library had ultimately changed the course of European political history. The young archivist who had once believed in preserving royal heritage had instead become instrumental in dismantling a system of hereditary privilege that had been built on lies and theft. The future remained uncertain, with ongoing investigations likely to continue for years as law enforcement agencies work to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy. But Victoria felt confident that the truth, once exposed, could not be hidden again. The era of unquestioned royal privilege was ending, replaced by demands for transparency and accountability that would reshape how democratic societies related to their traditional institutions. Her journey from palace librarian to international whistleblower had been more difficult and dangerous than anything Victoria could have imagined. But as she prepared to continue fighting for justice, she knew that her decision to speak the truth had been the right choice, regardless of the personal costs. Some secrets were too important to stay buried, and some truths were worth any sacrifice to bring to light.